So let's take a look at shape 13, and this shape's kind of a doozy. It's probably the hardest shape on the shape sheet, but I hope to make it a lot simpler by teaching you a new tool in this video, known as the Fillet Tool. And so I want to start by sketching out this top platform here. So let's create a new sketch, and let's select our top face, and make sure top is being read left to right, not up and down. And then what I want to do is I want to start with a rectangle tool, because if I look, this looks kind of like a rectangle with two rounded edges. And so let's grab our rectangle tool, and I'm going to click and drag and just click again. I'm not going to add the dimensions just yet, and we'll add the arcs in a little bit. So I'm going to right click and hit cancel. And if I look, I can see the depth from front to back of this is 1.5. So let me grab my dimension tool. From front to back has a depth of 1.5. Hit enter, right click and hit cancel. If we look, figuring out the width of this is a little bit harder. So how do we figure it out? Well, actually, I'm going to come back to that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and add these three holes, and then I'll use those to help me figure out my total width. And so I'm going to grab my circle tool, and I want to draw just 3 circles in the middle of my rectangle. And if I look, my first circle, it says it has a diameter of 0.25, and then it says times 3. And what that means is not multiply that by 3, but it's saying all 3 of these holes have the same dimensions. And so I'm going to select my dimension tool, and I'm going to tell my first circle to be 0.25. And then I'm going to tell my other 2 circles to be equal to this first circle using my equal constraint. And so I told this circle to be equal to this one, and I want to tell this circle to be equal to the first one. And so now all 3 circles have a diameter of 0.25. I want to go to my home view so we can get a better look at this shape, and hopefully you can start seeing what we're building. I'm going to right click and hit cancel to get out of my equal constraint. And then if I look, I can see that the center of these 2 circles are horizontal to each other, denoted by this line right here. And so if I grab my horizontal vertical constraint and I select these 2 centers of my circles, they are now horizontal to each other. And if I look, the same marking is happening between these 2 circles with a vertical constraint. And so I'm going to continue having this constraint selected and select these 2 circles. I'm going to right click and hit cancel. And so now these circles are vertical to each other, these 2, and these circles are horizontal to each other. Okay, so what else do I know? Well, I know the distance between these 2 centers of my circles is 1.75. So let me grab my dimension tool, and I want to select these 2 centers, and I want to tell it to be a distance of 1.75. And hit enter, right click and hit cancel. Now, if your circle went outside, it's no big deal. Just select it and bring it in. If it's outside of this edge, that's no big deal. You can make this rectangle wider. I want my circle centered inside this rectangle. And then, so what else do I know? Well, I know the distance between these 2 circles is 0.75. And so let me grab my dimension tool, and I'm going to select these 2 centers and tell them to be 0.75. And then I know the distance from the center of this circle to this edge over here is 0.375. And so if I select this center and this edge, that's 0.375. Speaking of dimensions of 0.375, if you notice, this arc right here has a radius of 0.375. And it says times 2. All that means is both arcs, this arc and this arc, have this radius. But why do I bring that up? We haven't drawn the arc yet. Well, if you notice, this arc has the same center of this circle right here. So what that means is this center point to this edge is equal to the radius of this arc. In other words, this center point to this edge is a distance of 0.375. Hit enter. And the same is true from this center point to this edge. If this arc has a radius of 0.375, that means the end of my arc to the center point is 0.375 by definition. So let me select this center point and this edge and type in 0.375. And you'll notice I now have a fully constrained width of this rectangle. The entire width ends up being 2.5. I'm going to right click and hit cancel because these three dimensions add up to 2.5. Let me deselect my lines. And so now we more or less have this shape without the arcs. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, let's grab our circle tool or grab our arc tool. But I actually want to show you a new feature, and that is over here in our modify panel. It's known as our fillet, and it might be underneath modify. You might have to go down here, but it's our fillet tool. And all a fillet tool does is it takes a sharp corner and makes it rounded. And so if I select these two lines, which makes this corner, it'll round it off for me. And what is the radius? Well, we said it was 0.375. Hit enter. And so now we've turned that sharp corner into a rounded edge. And so we can do the same thing over here on this side. I'm going to select my fillet tool again, and I want to select these two edges, and I want to type in 0.375 and hit enter. And so now if you look, it is the exact same shape as before. But you might notice what happened is it made it unconstrained. We no longer have a constrained sketch. It's completely blue. And so if I select this line, we can see why. It is now free to move around. We effectively, let me undo that movement. We effectively just deleted the corner of our shape that was connected to our origin. So this can now freely move. That's no big deal. I'm just going to give this shape a new origin. Let me go back to my top view. And all I'm going to do is find my coincident constraint. And I'm going to tell the center of my circle to be coincident to my origin. And so all we did was just shift it down and to the left a little bit, but now we have a fully constrained sketch with a different origin. So I'm going to finish my sketch, hit my home view, and I want to extrude this shape up. I want to make sure I don't select those three circles, and it extrudes up a distance of 0.25. Hit enter. And so now we have this bottom platform of our shape. And so what else do we need? Well, we need to build this shape up. And for now, I want you to ignore this curve. We'll talk about that in a second. I just want to focus on this rectangular beam that comes up right here. And so I want to start a new sketch on this face. And I want to grab my rectangle tool. I'm going to tell it to be coincident to this corner and drag down and just click. And so what are the dimensions of this rectangle? Well, if I notice it has a depth of 0.5, so if I grab my dimension tool and select these two, that is a width of 0.5. And so what about our width? What about the distance between these two lines? Well, we're going to have to use a little bit of math to figure it out. But basically, because this shape is connected at the top by an arc, and we know that arc has a radius of 0.5, what that means is from the center to either side is a distance of 0.5. 0.5 plus 0.5 is a distance of 1 inch. And so now I'm going to finish my sketch and extrude this shape up. And so how far does it go up? And you may be tempted to think, well, it only goes up 1 inch. And you could do it that way. We learned how to do it that way in our last video, to extrude it up 1 inch and then add another extrusion with this circle coming out of it. But I want to show you a new trick. I want to show you how to use what's known as the 3D fillet. And so I'm going to build too much and then cut away. We're going to use the subtractive method here. And so how far does it go up all the way to its peak? Well, from the bottom to the center point is 1 inch. And then from the center point to our peak of our arc is another 0.5. And so it goes up a total height of 1.5. And hit enter on our keyboard. And you might say, well, Mr. Anderson, this looks nothing like this shape over here. This is way too tall. And it only looks too tall because of the rectangular shape. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. But we have a 3D version of our fillet as well. So if I select my fillet tool and select this edge, I'm going to give it a radius of 0.5. And hit OK. And you can see what happens is it rounds off that edge. If I grab my fillet tool again, I can do the same thing to this second edge. In fact, I could have selected both of them at the same time and type in 0.5. And what that does is it effectively rounds off both edges. And since this had a total width of 1 inch and I gave each radius 0.5, 0.5 plus 0.5 makes it a perfectly tangent semicircle. I'm going to hit OK. And then one more thing is this rounded edge, we can actually use our fillet tool to create that as well. I'm going to select this edge, and if I just drag it up, you can see what happens. It adds a fillet here as well. I want to make sure I type in a radius of 0.5 before I hit OK. And so you can see how useful that fillet tool is and how much simpler this shape becomes when we start to use it. And so now you can add that feature to your tool belt when you're working in Fusion. But we have one more thing to do. We have to cut out this circle here. And so I'm going to start a new sketch on this face. And I want to grab my circle tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the center of this arc. And so I want to find the apex of this arc up here and then drag it down. You'll see that dotted line appear. And if I get low enough, you'll notice a circle pop up. And that circle represents the center of this arc. And so if I find that circle and then click and drag and then type in my dimension of 0.5, that's the diameter, it automatically fully constrains it. This circle is now concentric with this arc. And if you missed it, it's no big deal. After you draw it, you can just go to your constraints and find your concentric constraint and then select both these arcs and it'll effectively do the same thing. I'm going to right click and hit cancel. But now we have a fully constrained sketch. I'm going to finish it and hit extrude and cut this circle out all the way through because it says through here and hit OK. And that's it. Let's go ahead and save it as shape 13 and we are done with this shape.